What's up, K1? We're in week 6 of our B.L.E.S.S series where we're looking at the second S of the B.L.E.S.S, which stands for share your story.
Yeah, because here's the reality. Hardly ever is someone going to choose to start following Jesus because we sold them a convincing enough argument.
Although we lawyers like to think that we could.
Well, the proof is in the pudding. People become personally intrigued with the possibility of what Jesus could do for their life when they hear the very real things that he has done in ours. So, for instance, we can tell people that God is a redeemer, and that might seem nice to them, but when we share with them the very real way that God redeemed, say, our marriage, that speaks.
Yes, it does.
And we could share with somebody that God has a plan for their life, but to them, it may just feel like hype. But if we share with them the emptiness that we once felt when we were striving for the things of this world, and they identify with that, and then we share with them the peace and fulfillment that we're now experiencing now that we're living into our God purpose, that speaks. We could tell somebody that God loves them and has the power to change their life, and they likely will listen, but maybe doubt that that could be true for them. But when they hear us share about that addiction that once gripped us, that God has set us free from, that speaks.
And I think it speaks loudly.
Yeah, so bottom line, there is power in our story because it is how the truths of God come alive for people in real and tangible ways.
Right, in the flesh.
Yeah, so then why are we not all out there sharing our story? We think there are a few reasons that we want to talk to you about. So Pastor Dave, will you start talking about some of the wrestles people may have that's keeping them from sharing their powerful story?
Yeah, well, first off, to share a story of what God has done in our life, we must have a story to share, which I didn't have for a long time. So we may attend church, but we haven't been transformed by God. If we haven't been transformed by God, then we can't share. No, we can't share about God. And then after we have a story, we need to know it, and we need to know the various stories within our story. So, do you know your salvation story? Do you know the various God stories within your salvation story? Do you really know? Do you really know how to articulate?
It's a good question.
Your story. I mean, remember, our story can be about a salvation moment.
Yep.
Or it can be our story of how we found freedom from a stronghold or an addiction, and that's powerful. Or it can be a story about how God transformed us in some way or moved us from this place in our life to another place in our life.
Yeah, that's good.
And then another reason why people struggle to share their story is because they haven't taken the time to own it, to think through it. Someone gave me some great advice after God saved me and I began this God journey. They told me, Dave, you really need to write out your God story and then keep adding to it as you progress throughout life. That advice, Pastor Jenna, has really been invaluable to me because it helps me own the various God stories within my big picture God salvation story, and so that I can use it, and I'm prepared to use it at various times when I'm interacting with people. So if you haven't done it yet, I highly recommend that you write out your God story and then keep updating it as you progress through life. The one thing that I like about being able to share my God story, Pastor Jenna, is, and really the other stories within that salvation story, is that no one can argue with my story. Now, they may not choose to believe in the God I'm testifying to, but they can't argue with my story.
No, your story is your story.
My story is my story.
Yeah, no, that's so good. I think that's so important. Know your story, have a story.
Right.
Know your story, and then be able to articulate it and the various stories within the story. That's so good. The other thing that I just want to sort of thread through here is to remind us that earlier in this series, we talked about how important it is to listen to people, because it's when we listen to people that we're making them feel valued and seen, but it's also where we get to hear their real heart issues, like where they're struggling in life, so that we know how best to share various parts of our story that genuinely speak to them about where Jesus Christ can meet them in that place.
So listen first.
Listen first.
Listen first.
Here's what happens. When we don't do that, we might share our story because we get excited, but it can be tone deaf at times.
And maybe even off-putting.
Yeah, and like dismissive of people. And so One of the things that I think is we can ask ourselves is, have I earned the right to share my story? In other words, have I listened to them? Have I spent intentional time with them over a meal or coffee or something like that? Have I served them so that they know that I really love them and that they matter to me? When we try to share our story before we've invested in people in this way, it just risks our story being more about us than really about their moment.
So don't go knocking on your neighbor's door and say, hey, can I share my salvation story with you? No, that's not what we're suggesting, right? No. Listen first, Pastor Jenna, right?
Yep.
Then share. Bottom line, in order to share our story, we have to know our story.
Yep.
The story of how God saved us or freed us or transformed us in some way. So again, do you know your story? Can you share it in a relatable and concise way? I encourage you to write out your story this week so that you can share it or parts of it when you hear opportunities to do so.
Yeah.
So enjoy your discussion time. We'll see you all next week. Peace out.